So I think we're officially started now, and so I will say hello.
Hi.
And today we are here with Renee Bronson. Today's date is February 12th, 2023, and it is Kissimmee, Florida. And we have a nice chime. Go ahead. Okay, so we're back. We had a brief interruption to try and silence the chimes in the background. Okay, and so as we were saying, we are here with Renee Bronson. And today we're going to talk about a little bit about her life, and then we're going to talk about the story of Oscar Mack. But first, let's start with your background. Can I ask you to share your place and date of birth?
Yes, March 13th, 1953, and I was born at Osceola Hospital in Kissimmee, which was very near what is today downtown Kissimmee.
Okay, great. And can you tell us your parents' names?
My mother was Madeline Keene Bronson. Her maiden name was Keene, and her father, Ira Keene, was a former mayor of Kissimmee. And there was a tale about that family that my grandmother had to borrow his shoes to go vote for him for mayor because she didn't own a pair of shoes. They had 11 children in a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house on Main Street in Kissimmee.
Okay.
And my father was Richard Odell Bronson. He went by Odell. And he was a home builder, and he owned cattle and citrus later, and a lifelong resident of Osceola County, both of them were.
And so they were from Kissimmee or just the area?
Kissimmee.
The Kissimmee, okay. Okay. And I think you already kind of said what your parents did. What your mom do?
She worked in his business. When I was very small, she worked in a pharmacy. And then when his business kind of took off, then she worked with him from then on. And when I graduated college and came home and joined the business, I got her a Social Security number and started making sure she got paid a salary, because women back then didn't do that. And then when their husband died, they were in trouble. Mm-hmm. And so that was my role in the family.
About what year was that?
1973.
About 1973, okay.
Okay. And I guess I should say before we go on that we also have Sherry DuPree, which I forgot to mention. We have Sherry DuPree. Okay. Sorry about that.
Save the best for last.
Yes, indeed. Okay, and so how about your brothers and sisters?
So I was an only child for the first 9 years, and then got a baby brother, Richard Odell Bronson Jr. And he was born around 61, because I was 62 maybe. And he died in 1998 in a car accident. He left 2 children behind. And then my youngest sibling is my sister Cindy. She was named for my mother's mother. Her name is Cynthia Lynn Bronson. And she was born in about 68, and she's still living today. She's the one who just had an emergency appendectomy, so we're thankful she's still with us. And she has 1 child. I don't think I said that my husband and I together have 7 children. 5 of them are my biological children.
Okay. Well, do you want to give the names of all those kids?
Sure.
Okay.
So the oldest is Amanda Renee Hendrix. She is is 47. Born in 76. Let's say it that way. And then Courtney Elizabeth Hendrix, born in 1980. And Lindsay Ann Hendrix and Lauren Lee Hendrix were born in 1982. And Brandon James Hendrix was born in 84. And then my husband's children are Brian Mogensen, born in 1980, and Brett Mogensen, born in 1988. And all of them, except Lindsay, are still with us and have their own children now. Lindsay passed away from an auto accident in 1998 as well. And we have number 17 grandchild is coming in April.
Beautiful.
Okay.
We are never bored.
You are a true champion, I would say. All right. Well, let's talk about where did you go to school? I started from elementary school.
So I went to school in Kissimmee my whole through high school. I graduated Osceola High in 1971, and I graduated Friday night and left Saturday morning for FSU. And I was there for 2 years, and then I got married and transferred to UCF. And we were here for a year, and my husband took a job running a cattle ranch in Kentucky. So I graduated from Western Kentucky in 1975, I think. And then much later, went to Rollins and received a master's degree in 1991.
What were your degrees in?
Bachelor's psychology, master's counseling and human development.
Psychology.
And then I did some postgraduate work in energy psychology, which I am still practicing to this day. That's what I love.
In psychology.
So energy psychology, what is that exactly?
It's a comprehensive set of psychologies that study the interactions in the body between energy and how it travels through the body, and how it's very based on Eastern science about the acupuncture meridians and the points where energy enters the body and leaves the body, and the chakras. And what we do is a mild form of tapping, which we place in the same points that they use for acupuncture, but we do it without needles. And so my clients will come up with an affirmation to pair with their tapping. And as they tap, they recite the affirmation, and that creates a shift in the body's energy flow. And they get changed and they get better. And I love what I do. I'm still working, and I'll be 70 in March.
So looking back, now we can look back a little bit. Your school years here in Kissimmee, how would you rate your school in terms of getting a good education?
Well, I'd have to say I didn't struggle when I got to FSU or UCF or Western, but I'm kind of I love to learn. And I don't know how much of that's a function of me and my personality and how much is Osceola's education, but I didn't struggle. And the biggest difference was probably culture shock, because in Kissimmee there were 200 in my graduating class. And I got up to FSU and took one trip to the library and went, ugh. And then I left FSU with, a good GPA. I think it was probably 3.4, 3.5 or something. I graduated with honors from Rollins. And so they must have done a decent job.
Okay.
Osceola schools, and I have to give my grandmother's credit. I had a lot of time with both my grandmother, my father's mother, and my great grandmother, who was my grandfather's mother, and on my dad's side. And both of them were very serious about academics.
Okay, so they really emphasized education,
Yes.
you think? Okay. That helps a lot.
Yes, absolutely.
So was your school, just speaking now, in K through 12, or was it segregated at
Yeah.
that time?
Up until 7th grade. And so when I was in 7th grade, Osceola integrated schools, and there was a big upheaval. The first African American teacher that I had was my 7th grade biology teacher. And he was a character, thank God, because he could pull off coming into the school, taking a classroom, and having good control and teaching seriously. And he didn't get caught up in the hoopla. Because it was the same time when the teachers were striking. I believe for more pay. But the issues were kind of blended, and there were people who were very anti the strike and people who were very anti-immigration, and it was all kind of chaotic. But when I say that, I remember hearing more about that at home than I heard about it at school, because school was still run very methodically. We didn't have a lot of active conflict at school. Mostly you heard about it at home or on TV.
Well, so there was obviously like a black high school and a
It
black.
was separate, yes.
Yeah.
And I remember that they had their own band and football game. Everything was separate.
Yeah.
But I have to say, in my home growing up, there were African American people who helped us. And they were, in my mind, always just part of the family. I didn't see them as separate. I loved them, and they were good to me.
So I'm just going by my school experience, but there was never any kind of African American history ever discussed, or Native American history at all. Nothing like that. So in the history classes, what did they teach in the history classes?
They might have talked about slavery, but that was about the extent of it in my memory. What I do remember quite vividly, though, is my story about what happened at my church. Can I tell that now? So I'm in 10th grade, and my best friend and I are in the Z class with some African American girls that we got to know really well. We loved them. They were fun. I think they loved us. They sure treated us like they did. And when our church literature, for which was United Methodist, encouraged us to invite the local, I believe it was A&E church, their youth. And so we sent an invitation. And when we saw our friends at school, we invited them personally to come to our church. And they didn't have a youth group on Sunday night like we did. They just went to church on Sunday morning. So that's when they came. And we all sat together and we had a good time. Went out to lunch afterward. And I remember it being no big deal to me. Well, Monday morning at school, I get a call to the principal. And I get interrogated about just exactly what had happened on Sunday. And I told him. He said, well, your father wants to see you. You need to go home. And I didn't know this at the time. I just knew how angry my dad was at me. But I found out later that morning he was a builder, so he had construction loans. The bank had called and told him all of his loans were due that day because his daughter was a troublemaker and a communist. The pharmacist and the grocery both called him and told him his bills were due that day and his accounts were closed because his daughter was a troublemaker and a communist. I don't usually cry when I tell this story. I'm usually kind of peeved. It's sad today because just remembering him and thinking of him being in that hardship situation. What I usually remember when I tell it is how mad he was at me, and I was kind of mad at him too. We were not happy people. But he told me that because of that, I was not going to get a new car when I turned 16, as he had formerly promised, but that I was going to share the vehicle with the man who kept the construction sites clean and the yards kept up. And he was a janitor type person, and he had the truck 2 or 3 days a week, and I would get the other 2 or 3 days. Well, the truck didn't have a gas gauge. So it was very hard for us to keep up with who had put gas in when, and I ended up doing a lot of walking. And it gave me a lot of time to think about the whole situation. You know, to this day, it just breaks my heart. Nobody meant any ill will with what we did. Nobody, not one person. And yet it got turned into this abomination that it wasn't. And I felt misunderstood and carried shame around that most of my life. I had heard, not specifically of Oscar Mack by name, but I had heard that there was some racial conflict in my family's past and that my grandfather had been murdered. But I never really connected that with what was happening to me until later. And just seeing the context of what it must have been like to be African American and in Kissimmee in 1960s. Ironically, my 7th grade biology teacher became a friend of my husband's when my husband first moved to Kissimmee from Gainesville. He was a Gator. And you know, they both were relatively progressive and liberal in their thinking. And I didn't know this till years later, but my teacher's sister was a domestic helper in my home. And I loved her. She was the sweetest lady and smart, really smart. She really encouraged me and supported me academically. And she had a strong influence on how I dressed. She'd say, this goes with that better than what got over there, and helped me. I just always thought she was a character builder. But, you know, that's how subtle the racism was, that I wasn't, for whatever reason, I was never told that she was my teacher's sister.
Wow. And what was your biology teacher's name? Do you know?
Evan McKissick, Evan D. McKissick Jr. And you had to get the whole thing right.
Do you know how to
You
spell
never
it?
just called him Mr. McKissick or Mr. Evan. It was Mr. Evan D. McKissick Jr.
Junior.
And do you remember how to spell that? Just
EVAN D, and then MC capital K ISSIC. Oh yeah, that name is burned in my brain forever. He was impressive. He was also the first openly gay man I ever knew. And he never talked about being gay. It wasn't that he, you know, wore a label, but he made it very clear that he was different. And I don't think he would have ever used the word controversial, but the message was clear. He was gonna make his presence known in Kissimmee. And I guess he died here. I'm pretty sure he had a whole full career in Kissimmee.
The McKissick name is very famous among African Americans. I want to go back. Did you ever share that information with the Black people in the community? What happened to you? Did they ever know?
Well, the girls who came to church knew
Uh-huh.
and were just like we were, like me and my friend, just in shock.
Yeah.
It was interesting because my friend's parents were not local.
Okay.
And they didn't punish her and they didn't reprimand her.
That was my question.
Get her in any trouble that I knew of.
Mhm.
If they did, she never told me.
I see.
But I got a very strong sense from, because I was in their home, she was in our home, I was in her grandparents' home, and they loved me. They were good to me. in a close way. When, unfortunately, later that friend was murdered at Disney World by a psychotic murderer. And so I've remained very close with her family throughout my life.
What was the name?
Debbie McCartney was her name. And she was, Deborah G. McCartney was her legal name. And she
McCartney.
was somehow, she got involved with some people who weren't good people the year after we graduated high school. And she, during our senior year, she became pregnant and had a child she gave up for adoption. And when she was killed, I've always thought that somehow involved the people she had been hanging out with, if you will.
Yeah.
See, I was off in Tallahassee, so I missed a lot of it. But when I got married, she was my bridesmaid, and she was one of my very favorite people of my whole life. She could have fun and carry a conversation with anybody, and very loving person. You know, needless to say, she and I both reached out to these friends and said, you know, come see what it's like at our church, and maybe sometime we could come to yours. But that never happened.
I understand that.
And her killer is in prison, and every year, for years and years and years, her father would organize letter writing campaign to the board to not allow his release. And now I believe her father has died, but her mother's still living, and we still write the letters. Now it's only about every 5 years, but we just wrote one a couple years ago, just to honor her.
Thank you for sharing that.
Sure. You'll find I'm pretty transparent.
Yes.
I work that way in my therapy as well. I've always resisted the idea that you're not as successful therapeutically and you're not as clinically adroit if you're disclosing a lot of self-experience, and I don't believe that. The therapist who really helped me with a lot of these experiences and reprogramming them, those people were very transparent and very close. So, for what it's worth.
Okay. You know, that's one thing that we did omit. We could ask you what you do for a living.
Oh, yeah. Funny, I didn't think of that. It doesn't seem like work to me at this point, because my practice is here in my home. You probably saw my standing desk. That's where I see my clients all day on the screen. And I love what I do. It's not always fun. Sometimes I have very serious cases that require a lot of consulting and sharing wisdom and experience and expertise with other professionals. But most of my cases are relatively benign, the walking wounded, you know, and I just love my clients and love what I do. I think I would be miserable if I couldn't work. I missed about 20 years of working when I had cancer and had to be on disability because I was unable to work. And looking back, I think that's part of why I'm not giving up and retiring, because
Roughly how many patients do you have, and what do you call them? Clients?
clients, usually I call them clients.
Good.
Some of the insurance rhetoric makes us call them patients, but they're my clients. So at any given time, I probably have 30 to 40, no big caseload because I am 70.
Individual managing all of this on your own. So I can see
Exactly.
that.
My husband helps a lot. He does all the insurance collections, and
Yes.
he goes to the bank and the post office. And
Sure.
so he's a wonderful help. But as far as the client contact goes, I do all the scheduling myself and intake. Yeah. I worked in a big hospital for many years. And when I got cancer, that's when I went out on disability. And then I've worked in different private practices. My practice now is technically associated with a church. St. Luke's up in Dr. Phillips invited me to come there when I was finally able to resume my practice after cancer. And two of the people I knew in graduate school are there. One especially was one of my best friends in my program. And she called and said, why don't you come up here a day a week? Next thing I know, I'm driving up there 3 days a week and then 4. And then the pandemic hit.
Yes.
And we converted to telehealth. And because I have 2 immune deficiencies, my immunologist doesn't want me back in face-to-face work. He wants me online only.
He's looking out for your best interests.
He is. He's up at Duke. We drive to North Carolina for my immunologist because he's the best he found. And he's very merciful. During the pandemic, he's let me just do telehealth with him too, so that we aren't on the road getting sick.
You can stay active. That's the main thing.
That's it. That's right. You do not want to get stagnated,
Absolutely.
clueless, immobile. What we had to move to get set up was my yoga mat, and you might have seen my bike over in the back room. Every morning I hit that bike first and then the mat. That's the only reason I'm in as good shape as I am,
Excellent.
as healthy as I am.
Okay, well, I think we're ready to kind of transition over to talking about Oscar Mack. Oscar Mack. Before we do that, there's one question that I just like to ask. Were you aware in any way, like growing up, and or when did you become aware of, let's just say, your white privilege? Did you, I know it wasn't, all the permutations of that.
Right.
You know.
It wasn't real early, or needless to say, all at once. But I remember when
Was there an aha moment?
I was probably in 4th grade. And the lady who was helping my mom in the home at the time, her name was Tina. I want to say her last name was Barrington. And I can't remember her husband's first name. But they were a couple who had several children. And I remember their children going through school with my sister and brother. So the ages were about the same. And what I remember is that she had a grandchild while she was helping my mom. And they wanted me to name that baby. And it was kind of like, why would you want me to name the baby? Because I don't really know your family that well, which was very telling. And then it was, well, I thought of my 2 favorite people in the world. And one of them, her name was Ina Claire, which is kind of a probably not common African American name, Ina Claire, at the time. And so when I wrote it down for her, I remember she kind of looked at me funny, and I thought, and I didn't know the names of her other children, and that kind of hit me. It was like, well, maybe I should name it something similar to the other children, but then I didn't know their names. So it's like, this is a tough job, you know. And they did name her that. They named her Ina Claire Barrington, but she was always known as Pumpkin. And I remember thinking, did they not like it? Or, you know, like, oh, did I mess that up? Because what hit me, I don't know that it was, I'm privileged because I have this fancy name, which was rare in Kissimmee and really a burden more than a blessing. Nobody could spell it. And I had a nickname too. I was called by my nickname because nobody could figure out how to spell Renee. So I guess that was the first time that I just thought, wow, there really is a barrier here. There is a difference. And I'm uncomfortable trying to navigate it. And I'd have to think longer to remember the next awareness.
And you were around 9 years old.
It was,
grade.
yeah.
Yeah.
It was surprising to be asked to name a baby when you're 9 years old. You know,
Yeah,
the whole
yeah.
thing kind of came out of nowhere. Yeah. I remember feeling very on the spot and in the spotlight in a way, and kind of like, why are you being so nice to me, giving me this privilege when it's your baby? You know, but I think I probably even protested and said some of that to her, and she was just like, because I love you so much. You know, it's not.
But I can see that. I can relate.
Well, thank you for that. Okay, well, let's ask about what is your family's connection with Oscar Mack?
Okay. So, as I understand it today, Oscar Mack did shoot my grandfather, my great grandfather, Stuart Ivy, in what now I understand must have been a Klan raid. Is that, I'm sorry, is that the right terminology? That even goes off when it's turned off. I'm sorry, it's a medication reminder. My earliest memory that I now understand connected to this incident was my grandmother, who was probably the most progressive woman in Kissimmee in 1950s, but even she referred to it as the night that nigger shot your granddad. And when she would say that word, even then, I knew it was wrong. President Kennedy had already been shot. I was very aware racially, and it bothered me. But she stopped using it over the years after that. She became more educated and culturally sensitive, if you will. And of course, having worked with the reporter on the story and now with you, Deborah, I understand it a lot more clearly than I did then. But I remember feeling this immediately deep shame about the whole thing. Like, what on earth was going on that somebody needed to shoot him? You know, and he was saving his own life is how he came to shoot my great-grandfather. And the first time I met with his great-grandson, James Brown, the first thing I said to him was, I'm so sorry that someone in my family put your great-grandfather in the position to have to kill to save his own life. And I carry deep regret with that. And deep, deep shame. But I have to say, Mr. Brown made it better. He's such a healing presence and such a loving man. And I feel like I have a new cousin.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I know that's hard to say.
It's not hard to say. It's just sad to me. It's still sad that that happened.
People are living
Why?
in such a time of hate toward each other.
Exactly.
Do something like that to another individual.
And today, I want to think that's a thing in our past. And I'm so painfully aware, this is where the poignancy comes in, that it's still with us. And we've tried so hard, all of us. You know, we marched, we prayed, we protested, we've tried so hard, so many of us. And we're not healed, and we are still broken, and we have much work to do.
Well, you got other influences coming into the
Exactly.
the way they are. They're not
Demonic
just a
that
man.
they are, I'm sorry, but I have to say that.
Yeah, and I think that needs to be brought into the picture. They were there in
Absolutely.
the early days as well.
That's right. That's
So
exactly
That's
right.
how, the Klan got started.
The toxicity and the evil
That's right.
has been with us, I guess, throughout our existence, and I
All
guess it
of our
always will be.
That's right.
But that's why healing is so important.
True.
And even yesterday, when I was at a traffic light, this truck pulled up to me, and it was obviously someone of great wealth, and they were displaying their political garbage, if you ask me to define it. And I was just so intimidated. I thought, I'm glad we took the bumper stickers off our car, because he might shoot me if we hadn't. We recently did that because my husband was at Walmart and the car got keyed because of a political bumper sticker. But the hatred and the evil is still very, very present.
It's very much present. I was talking to one of our white friends, and he had to go out and get a bumper sticker put on his car for a truck because he lives in a neighborhood like that. And he had the bumper sticker put on. He came by and told Herb and I that he had it put on because he said, I can't even get home and back and forth without having this bumper sticker on my car. He said, I do not represent that. And he said, I want you to know. And his wife has had one or two incidents. They're both non-African American. And they come by and they talk to us about what's going on in their community. And they live over in Williston.
That's tragic.
Yes. And right now, in fact, they're leaving, going to Australia. She is from Australia.
Good for her.
Yeah, she's from Australia and he's from Connecticut. And they married, and of course, they're down in Florida. And of course, he calls her the horse lady because she is a horse doctor. She's a vet. And so that's what brought her into Florida, to be a veterinarian for the very wealthy people down in Ocala.
Horses.
And horses. And that's what she does. And sometimes she runs the truck for them, for the horses. If they're going down to Miami or to a certain place, they have to have a vet on board. So she's one of the few lady vets that I know.
It's interesting because my son and his wife work for a large animal vet up in Bell, Florida, which is northwest of Gainesville. And they were just here, and they were very sad because their lady vet, her husband is the other vet in the practice, and he's recently had a stroke, and she's thinking about retiring, and the jobs will go away.
That's right.
But the greater loss for them in the community is these wonderful people who've loved all these large animals all these years.
She loves them. They live in Connecticut. They have a home in Connecticut, but now they have a home in Williston also.
Well, they might want to go look around Bell and find out if this practice is for sale.
I'll mention that to him when they come
Sorry,
back.
Deborah. I still have that real estate thing in my blood. That's what I did before I became a psychotherapist.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, we move on. Thank you for sharing that.
Thank you very much. Okay, so growing up, this little pitchers have big ears.
Yeah.
Do you recall hearing the adults or anyone talk about this lynching of Oscar Mack?
I did
Anything at all?
I do not remember them saying that he was lynched. And this is curious to me because apparently that was the local word on the street, right? But my aunt, who's 10 years older than me, I called her yesterday. Her name is Della Jackson. And she lives in Ocoee. And she's the one who found the picture of our grandfather. And she said that she had never heard that he was lynched. And it was as if maybe her mother knew, because she was Stuart Ivy's daughter. This would be my grandmother, Margaret Bronson, who was Margaret Ivy. And her name was actually spelled Marguerite, but she hated Marguerite, so she always said her name was Margaret. So we weren't allowed to say Marguerite, but that was her legal name. Anyway, she said that Granny never said to her that the man was lynched. She did. I don't know if they ever talked about where Oscar Mack was, but she said there was no mention of a lynching. Now, part of that might have been that people back then didn't tell children about murders. I mean, like now our kids are so bombarded with TV, they know everything from day one, but back then things were kept more close to the vest. Yeah. So I also never pictured them in a car. In my mind, it was like well, if it was a Klan raid, it must have been out in a field or, you know what I mean? And nobody ever told me before yesterday that the Klan members had been to his home and burned a cross as a warning. I never heard that before.
You're saying that the Klan went to Oscar Mack's house?
Max house.
That's what Chris told me.
I'd never heard that. No, I never knew that.
And the way that Aunt Della said it was, hadn't they already been there and given him a warning? And I said, not that I know of. And she said, well, I think I remember them saying that they burned a cross in his yard. So there's another oral history version. And my aunt is older, and she says, you know, my mind isn't as clear as it once was, but she's still very lucid when I have conversations with her. Like, she knows which one of my kids is which. That's a statement right there. Many of my friends don't even know my kids apart.
Well, you know, and you remember old memory is kind of stuck in you.
Sometimes those are clearer than the recent memory.
They really are.
They used to say that was a hallmark of Alzheimer's, but I don't think that's true. I think that's just nature.
Did they state why the cross was burned?
Of course not.
I didn't know, you know.
Yeah, they
Shared it among themselves.
maybe, but I never heard it. And I don't think she did. But in her mind, it was a warning.
It was a warning sign, I understand.
And I said to her, do you remember ever seeing or knowing a Klans member? And she said, no. It wasn't talked about.
And that's true.
Now, I wanted to ask her if she ever saw anybody in a white mask and gown, but at my age was showing, and I didn't think in the moment quickly enough to ask her that. But I just know she would have told me if she remembered seeing that. She never even saw it.
Well, that's interesting. New fact to me. I don't know about Chris. Never mentioned that. Maybe he just found it out.
And it may just be that my aunt said it, and it didn't come from Chris. I could be confusing that. Sorry.
Well, that's okay. That's great. Thank you for that. So you never heard any stories about in the community, just kind of, you know, every now and then, you know, people just talk and they want to share something exciting, but you never heard anything like this lynching that happened 8 decades ago at that
Not
point.
lynching. What I do remember, and I can't remember if I've already shared this with you, so it might be coming out of nowhere, but in high school, after the event at the church where I got in so much trouble, probably a year and a half, 2 years later, one of our friends at school was accused of murder. That she had murdered a local businessman or tradesman. I'm not sure what he did for a living. But his name was Chuck Tyner, probably Charles Tyner, but maybe Chuck anyway. Tyner. He was murdered down by the lakefront, is in my memory, but I don't know if that's accurate. And my friend who was accused, her name was Civell Smith, Civel. And she had been in several classes with me and was very bright. And she and I become buddies, and we had this thing we would do where we would like joke around, and she'd call me names and I'd call her names. It was kind of it was an interracial game because she'd be making fun of herself and the way she talked by talking to me that way. And then I would talk that way back to her, and we were all, it was a group thing. There were probably 5 or 6 of us. We'd laugh and carrying on like teenage girls do, or did then. I don't know if they still do. But today they're so serious, you know. They're so passionately trying to figure out their gender. and they're depressed from being confined in COVID, and they're struggling with much greater, different kinds of issues. But we thought it was funny, you know. I mean, I know she thought it was funny too, because she was with us, and then when her life was on the line, and they were interrogating her about this murder, she confided in us, and we actually went to her house, picked her up, went out together, probably to Ketchum's groceries for a Pepsi or something. I mean, it wasn't any big social life in Kissimmee, trust me. But the fear was in her, and we wanted to help. She was afraid to let us. She was afraid something would happen to us. She was very guarded about being around us, and she didn't want to be in public. And I don't know what happened. I think she may have gone to jail. I don't think she was there forever, because I remember seeing her at a reunion later on.
About what time span was this?
That was a bad deal. Like 70-ish, maybe 69, maybe 71, but that span of time.
Right.
And I would love to know more about that story. But what I remember about being involved in that was that the racism was there. And I don't know if anybody ever said it out loud, but I remember thinking, because she's black, they're going to kill her, they're going to hang her, they're going to ruin her. And again, wanting to help her, but her being afraid to let us. And the other friend involved in this, again, was Debbie, who's no longer with us to share what she remembers. So that sucks.
Well,
And another factoid, about 2 or 3 years ago, one of the girls who sat with us in church was back in Kissimmee. She, like many, got out of here as soon as she could and hadn't been back. She was famous because her father was famous. His name was Buster Lesane. Lesene, maybe?
Lesane, spell again.
Lesane, Lesene. And her father was Buster, and he owned the cab company, the local cab company. And her name was Juanita, which was the middle name of my mother. So we had a little bond going around that, and fun stuff. And she doesn't even remember coming to church with me, nor anything about me getting in trouble. So isn't that interesting? The other girl was Dravonda Youngblood, who now works in the prison system as a psychologist. And I've seen her at conferences, and we've talked. If she didn't remember it, she didn't tell me that. She seemed to remember the whole story the way I did. So that was curious.
Sometimes they mentally get rid of those stories in their
Because they're
mind.
so traumatic.
Because that's exactly what I was about to say, and they don't want it to come forward.
Right.
Uh-huh.
And Juanita, of the people who got together when she was in town, she had aged visibly,
Stress.
probably more than some of us, I want to say.
well, just run through some of these names. I think we already know the answer because you didn't really, you never really heard the story as you were growing up and all this. So you didn't know any of the family of the people in the car, which would be Eugene Reinhardt. Did you ever know anyone from the Reinhardt
I've heard the name Reinhardt my whole life, but I didn't know anybody specifically. Like a person who had 2 names, last name Reinhardt, no.
Okay. And then how about J.T. McClellan, who was the owner of the...
Same thing. McClellan was a name in the area, but what did he own?
He owned the Turpentine, the Turpentine, I guess, is it a still or a mill? A still.
Time industry, let's just put it.
Yeah.
And that includes all of it.
Mhm.
The steel
Yeah.
and industry.
And anything, do you remember any mention about the sheriff farmer who was,
Now, there are farmers still here, and I went to school with somebody named Farmer, but I don't remember anything being said about the sheriff.
well, apparently he was a character in his day. He was a bootlegger. Of course, remember, this is during Prohibition.
Well, it's interesting because the turpentine thing. So my parents later, after the business was going pretty well, bought some property south of Hoakaw, way down deep in Osceola County. And there was supposed to be a turpentine mill or still or something in that area where their property was. They sold it before they died, but they kept it for a long time, and he planted groves there, and everybody teased him about how his grove looked like it was manicured with a nail file. He was a real perfectionist. But the turpentine mill, I remember being shown where that was. And so what was, turpentine was a medicine? For clean, like an antiseptic?
It's an antiseptic. Also, they use it in the highways. They put it in the tar when you to tar some of the early roads. Also, it was sometimes used. They call it a roslin. This was the stuff that dripped from the side and kind of thick. And the first houses, they did, when you put the tin roofs on, they would put this around the nail to prevent it from leaking.
With the resin.
Yes, the resin, And so turpentine was extremely important. Also, it was used on the ships to seal those early wooden ships that we have up and down the waterways in the early days. So it was very, very important to our economy at that time. But now it's made manufacturally from a chemical.
Of course. So
Yeah.
Kill the planet.
Of course, of course.
there's also a story, and this might trigger a memory, but the reason given why these men went to Oscar Mack's house was because of let's say a turpentine hand or someone who worked in the turpentine industry had abandoned his family. And so what that did was it kind of left the, I guess the burden of caring for the family on this McClellan guy, you see? So that was their excuse for going to Oscar Mack's house. But did you ever hear that story thrown around?
So were they saying that because he had been in his family, Oscar Mack had something to do with him abandoning his family?
This, I guess, I admitted the most important part is they went to the wrong house. It's a mistaken identity. However, the only problem with that story is that earlier they had asked where Oscar Mack lived.
Oh,
So,
yeah, that kind of shoots it apart.
So, and the other part that I would, I know, you may know the answer to this, but we know Oscar Mack had the gun. It was given to him by C.C. Collins, right? We know that. But what we have never heard in any of the accounts is the people in the car probably had a gun, but they never mentioned that.
Oh, they just didn't.
Never mentioned it at all.
They probably did have a gun. I mean, back then everybody carried a gun.
Yeah, it was never mentioned, and
Well, they had a gun. They probably had several if the truth was known. And especially if they were tied in with the Ku Klux Klan, that was one of their goals. They did carry guns.
it's just interesting how the newspapers have, kind of, I guess, helped the Klan with their mission.
Whitewashed or...
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's the best term. You used it.
Well, I grew up in Connecticut in a town called West Hartford. There was one black family in the entire town. Betsy Johnson was the little girl that was my age in school. And we never heard of, there wasn't the concept of black people, hardly at all. And when we learned history, which I loved, I absolutely adored history, I learned everything. We learned a history that was basically white history. There were no black parts except I guess we mentioned Booker T. Washington. He got a little accolade in there, and a few of these sideline people that we put in just to kind of color up the book a little bit. But there was not really any Black history at all, and Reconstruction was taught as a horrible period of time when the South was forced to undergo sort of a humiliating period of time, and people who were not really allowed to, not really qualified to be in government took over, and there was an intense amount of corruption. There was corruption everywhere, and a lot of it was because of carpetbaggers and scalawags. And the carpetbaggers and scalawags, blacks didn't even get a chance to be part of the corruption. They were like following the scalawags, who were Southerners who had turned against the South, and carpetbaggers were people like Adelbert Ames, who came down from the North and took places in the South. And that's what we were taught. And I love the Civil War. Civil War was one of my favorite things. I had Civil War cards, Civil War books. One of the saddest things I did was give away all these Civil War books to one of my grandchildren, Edison, who now has them all, and I hope he enjoys them as much as I did, but I doubt it. He's a football player. But anyway, we went to, I went through all this, and then I came down to the South, and it was quite different from the North, quite different from Connecticut to Florida. And I found also, and when I went through my education, that history was quite different than I learned it. And I became really fascinated with the period of Reconstruction. I became really fascinated with the period after Reconstruction, when the Redemption took over. And the massacres that took place was basically a second Civil War, as the white supremacists took back over, and in places like in Louisiana and Mississippi, they had attacks on Black people right and left. There was murdering of people who had been in the state legislature. And I don't want to go to a big history lesson here, because there's so much to that. But basically, everything I knew was wrong. So I went back and found out all these other things. So I made a study and kept a lot of readings on those periods of time. And there were some very sad periods of time. One of the saddest periods was after World War I. Because in World War I, the African Americans went over with the soldiers, the ones that didn't die of flu on the way over, and fought with the French. And the French treated African Americans like equals. And then, even though they were in black units, they were treated like soldiers. So when they came back, they had the expectation of being treated similarly in the United States. And that was quickly quashed with a whole number of uprisings. There was Tulsa, I guess you'd put Ocoee and Rosewood into those places too. But Arkansas, there was a horrible one up there. There were ones in the North. All over, there was this real deep reaction against the equalization of African Americans during World War I. And there were just horrible massacres. And this particular event, although, Renee told me about it, I wasn't really that familiar with it until she did, although I did know a lot about the Ocoee massacre. And I knew my son is a historian, and he's done things like digs, and he's gone up to Oakland and done digs up in those different places. And there was a whole tier of history that had just been wiped out. And we had been given this sanctified, history that came after it.
So when you moved to Kissimmee in 70?
I moved to Kissimmee in 73, and I was a teacher. I was a teacher in 7th grade, and I got to know...
Devin B. McKissick Jr.
Well, I taught with him. We had team teaching in that time, so 4 teachers worked together. I came out of a program at the middle schools. I was one of the first people in the state of Florida who got middle school certification, which has since been removed by the reactionary Republican educational system, if you can call it educational system. But we had a certificate that was based on teaching kids at middle school the kinds of things they needed to know, not just as junior high and not just as elementary kids, but in a separate sort of way. And one of the things was to teach them 4 things: social growth and learning, academic growth and learning, which was already there, technological, and organizational skills. Those 4 types of skills were put into the middle school movement, and there was a separate curriculum just for middle school kids. And I was the social studies teacher and had a job at the age of 22.
And Evan was the
And Evan Kissimmee was the
And-
biology teacher.
And
Yes.
all the time you spent around him, nothing was ever mentioned about the Oscar Mack incident.
No,
Okay.
no, he did not. He was a person who was very acceptable to the white ruling class. And it was kind of interesting because my first year there, I had a little fellow named Billy Johnson. And Billy Johnson was very interested in history and things too. And I mentioned one time I was talking about some of the things that I learned in college and the continuous learning I had about the Jim Crow era. And he said, "Oh, I know. My granddad used to, be in the Klan, and he took me to Gardner Island down in South Osceola, and he took me to a place where they had Klan meetings in the 1960s. Florida was really way behind most other states, even in the South. Up until 1968, we were still segregated. And
Did he have any lynchings, Billy Johnson? He later became the fire chief here.
well, Billy Johnson, no, he did not talk to me about lynchings, but he told me about the fact that they had Klan meetings regularly out there it was Johnson Island. I take it back. It was Johnson Island. Gardner was a camp out on Johnson Island. But Johnson Island is where they had these Klan meetings. He showed me where they had the bonfires and things. And I was amazed. And this was,
Never mentioned a lynching.
he did not, no. But Billy Johnson was a very genteel fellow. And I don't think that he would ever say anything that would indicate negativity towards anybody. But he was, the whole ruling caste of Osceola County in the late 60s and early 70s were white supremacists. And they were also all Democrats. And there was sort of what I call Bourbon Democrats. The Bourbon Democrats were very progressive in every place except one, and that was racial relations. And they had made this sort of deal, and they got along with the rest of the Democrats, around the country. And that's how Franklin Roosevelt kept this coalition together, is that he never really pushed civil rights to the extent that he could have. And there were a number of attempts to put civil rights through. Right after World War II, the same thing happened after World War I, in that we had this big movement towards civil rights. And there was something called the Southern Conference on Human Relations, who brought together a whole progressive group of people, mostly people who were whites and blacks who were very progressive. And they came along and they tried to put together a coalition of different people who were in favor of civil rights. And in 1947 and 48, they gained a number of seats. A person named Claude Pepper down here was a very strong progressive. And then what they did is they triggered the backlash of 1948, Strom Thurmond, and all of those people who came back in, and all the segregationist stuff began, and the white monuments, Confederate monuments went up, and all kinds of terrorist movements took place. And there really were 4 different clans. The initial Klan, which was right after the Civil War, and then there was a Klan that took over after everybody saw Birth of a Nation in 1915. And then there was a third Klan that came up in the late 20s, which was discredited because the leaders turned out to be all crooks. And then there was the fourth Klan, which took up in the 50s. And the fourth Klan was basically interested in keeping Jim Crow and segregation alive for as long as they could do it. And that lasted all the way into the 60s with guys like Governor Ross Barnett and George Wallace and people like that. And although they were not necessarily Klan members, they all had the same form of segregationist activity. And I don't know, that's just a lot of rambling, but I'm not, any questions you have, I'll be glad to answer.
Okay, so this is really interesting about the 4 different clans and I guess the succession of each, really, or the evolution maybe even.
Well, what happened is they would wax and wane. There would be things that they would go away and then they would come back. And they usually came back as a threat showed up. The 50s Klan, the 50s and 60s Klan was primarily there because we had, Brown versus the Board of Education, and we had a number of decisions that were beginning to really push for integration and for civil rights. There were some toothless civil rights bills again, which Harry Truman attempted to put through a civil rights bill, didn't succeed. He did take the Army and desegregate the units in the Army, which was bad enough for some people. And then there was a lot of, attempt to actually implement the Brown versus the Board of Education with, Little Rock, Arkansas, and all those things. And when they tried to actually do some of this stuff, that's when the Klan would kick back in again. And that's when you had the Emmett Till situation here, and all these things that we know, that everybody knows about historically. And then there are things that a lot of people don't know about historically, like the Oscar Mack situation. Yeah. But those things were widespread, they were everywhere. And lynchings were particularly horrendous after World War I, because once again, you had the African Americans were establishing the fact there was a claim to equality. And the only way that they could intimidate them was the most hideous forms of lynching. There were burnings, long-term burnings, where you burned like an inch of a person at a time. There were, lynchings that took place in a party atmosphere where all these families would go out there. And all this stuff, is the kind of thing right now that our present-day Klan member, Ron DeSantis, is trying to do again. Because Ron DeSantis is nothing more than the next iteration of the Klan. He is a racist, he is a fascist, he is an evil man, and he is a person who is attempting to bring back all of the badness that the American soul has. There is nothing good about Ron DeSantis. Stop.
I hit the play button.
You don't want me to hear what I have any more of to say about him. He is Trump, only without the funny parts.
And smart with it.
He is smart in some ways,
But he's stupid.
but he's not canny. Trump is canny, but not smart. And it's a matter of which is more important. Trump was always able to pick on the crowd and listen to what their worst and nastiest set of values were and play to that. DeSantis wants to bring people to his worst and nastiest sets of values. So he's not quite as canny as and that's going to be his downfall. His downfall will be he's going to be a little bit too arrogant, and people are going to turn from him. So we'll just see how long that takes.
I just thought you might have heard something about that story you're working on.
I heard the story.
Looking to the story.
Right, I heard the story from Renee at first. My son, Brett, researched it very heavily, and he also ran across some university professors that were into it. He followed the story a lot too. So it was something that had garnered enough attention so that my historian son was able to find out an awful lot about it.
Well, I can give you a real quick story about how that all happened, because up until 2013, no one knew Oscar Mack survived. And that came about by a class that was taught at Rollins College by a professor named Julian Chambliss.
Yeah, that's who he heard.
Julian Chambliss. And that was actually inspired by Curtis Michelton, who found a little newspaper article that said Oscar Mack had been lynched at Lake Jenny Jewel. And that was a big surprise to Curtis, who does this kind of work. So he got his friend Chambliss, to actually circle his class around this research, and their research showed that he had been lynched. So and part of the class was to make a website for all they had found. And they put it up, and Curtis kept it up for a number of years, even after the class was over and the students, as being students, were gone. and that was the end of their assignment. But that website was discovered by James Brown, and he called. James Brown is
I
the,
didn't know James was the one that found that website. See, now that's interesting because here you have two people who are completely unacquainted and unrelated, Brett Mogensen and James Brown, across the country, digging under the same story.
well, there was nothing about Oscar Mack. But Curtis was working with the Democracy Forum,
Marcus is fine.
and that's how they. Anyway, one thing, it's just a real interesting connection of events that led to this. So,
Now, the Democracy Forum was working with the Ocoee Massacre for 1920.
Which is where Brett was out digging.
In Oakland.
And that's
Ocoee,
right.
which is Oakland. Oakland is in Ocoee, right? It's right next door if it's not.
Yeah. Well,
And so
Brett-
that's where Brett was digging, and that's when he got interested.
Yeah, Brett was initially asked Renee, "Do you know this guy?" And we found out that it was actually Renee's ancestor. That was pretty amazing.
being a historian of this area, would you consider yourself an historian of this area, or?
Yeah, I guess you could. I'm certainly not an actual historian, but I am an observer and an investigator.
You're an educator also.
Well, I was an educator. I was a history teacher.
History teacher.
I was a principal. I was assistant principal. I was a civics teacher. And I was a government teacher.
And the rest of them is a Dead Horse Ranch.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
let me ask you this question. I was going to ask Renee, and Renee, you can definitely chime in. How do you think Oscar Mack could have escaped that night when everyone was out looking for him in this little, well, I assume it was a little town at that point, of Kissimmee? How could he have possibly have escaped?
I think, I've thought about this a lot, and I really think that postmaster who had given him his gun had to have helped him. Maybe not directly, but he must have arranged some kind of transportation. Because the woods then were so thick and dangerous, and on foot, he wouldn't have had a chance, is what I think. What do you think?
I think the same thing. There was, a bond often between African Americans and the whites down there. Of course, it wasn't an equal one, but it was one where there was a lot of affection. And I think this postmaster, if he actually gave this fellow a job, probably had a lot invested in him.
And his gun.
Yeah.
And he said to him, and this is the other reason I think he probably survived, he was a World War I veteran.
Right.
He had seen combat. He knew how to stay alive. He was savvy.
Yeah.
I heard. We talked about that on the way down here, that he had some skills that the average person would not have had to know how to survive. Okay.
Well, what about this report that, of course, Ocoee had happened in 1920, and so we're talking 1922, and the memory is probably still very vivid in African Americans' minds at this point. And that next day, 200 African Americans were leaving Kissimmee, and they were down there at the railroad station, leaving town. Do you think there's any way maybe he could have gone, or I don't know, slipped through that way, or I don't know, just?
That's a good question.
He could have disguised himself. He could have been slipped out.
Or could have been hiding in a bag. My grandsons did that when I took them to grandparents' camp. They hid in my suitcase, zipped themselves inside, and scared me flat to death. I was on the verge of calling their parents when they giggled, and I figured it out. Little turkeys.
Yeah.
Well, they did send people out in caskets also, and in big boxes, and you had the industry down here that dealt with fruits and so forth. So they could have put him in one of those crates
Oh, absolutely.
and sent him out that way.
Those field baskets, the
Yeah,
fruit basket was like a two-handle, two-container thing, but the field baskets were big enough to hide several people.
and there's probably, and they could have put it on the train as something that was going north,
Right.
and then that could have gotten him out of here that way.
There
I
were,
wish we could find out if the postmaster helped him.
yeah, that would be
He's a
my
hero.
guess.
I mean, he's already a hero, even if he didn't help him get away. But if he did, he's really the hero. story.
Yeah. And so we all know C.C. Collins, who was the assistant postmaster, actually, had to leave town the very next day. So, well, for obvious reasons.
In the trunk of his car.
To the bell.
Doesn't know. All right. So I think Renee, who's not in the picture at this moment,
Perfectly all right with me.
I think. I guess there's just one last thing I could ask is, do you remember your great grandmother at all? That would
Very
be
well. Very well. Her name.
okay. Hold on. Let's see if we can switch over to Renee.
So
We're
about
starting up again. So we're going to get Renee to speak about all she remembers about her great grandmother.
yes. I had two great grandmothers who were active and involved in my life as a child, and they were so completely and totally different that it's kind of a comedy. But Olive Virginia Miller, who my great grandmother was named when I came along, she had remarried after having been married to Stuart Ivy and having two daughters. So the daughters were my grandmother, Marguerite Virginia. Ivy became Bronson, and Della Ivy Powers, she was the younger of the two. She became the postmistress in Immokalee, and her husband was the warden of the prison down there. So anyway, my grandmother married my grandfather. It's a funny story. Do you want to hear it? So she was 15, and apparently Granny Miller, who was Olive Ivy, put her at Montverde Academy because she was possibly liking the boys a little too much. So she sends her to this girls' school, and my grandmother runs away to the rodeo. And there she meets Troy O. Bronson, who's a bull rider. She's 15 years old, and he wins a 25-pound bag of flour and whisks her off her feet and takes her to the JP, and they get married. And he takes her home to my other great-grandmother's home, and her name was Temperance Jane Sullivan Bronson. She grew up in what was known as the Sawgrass, and that's all I know about that. But anyway, so when I took developmental psychology or human development, they had us do a 3-generational interview. So I interviewed my grandmother, my mother, and my sister. And my grandmother, the questions were assigned. And one of the questions was, do you remember your first sexual encounter? And she said, yes, I do. It was my wedding night. And I said, when you were 15? And she said, yeah. She said, he won that rodeo and won that big bag of flour and took me to the JP, and we got married and took me home to his mother. And when it came time to go to bed, he said, do you want me to put out the light? And you may know I told him yes. And that was the story of her first sexual encounter. And that was all she was willing to share. But it was so precious because it just captured the time, you know, and where women's rights were in 19, whatever it was. Anyway, they went on to have 5 children. My father was the oldest. And my granny Temperance, had a spit can. And she's the one I spent most of my childhood with. She taught me to sew on her apron. I made a quilt when I was like 10 years old by hand. I still have it. She was a pioneer woman, and she was tough. But Granny Miller was very refined. She was the type of person who sent her daughter to a girls' school when she wasn't quite right. Very prim and proper. Her home was immaculate. There were doilies, starched and ironed on every flat surface. She always wore the black pump lace-up shoes, stockings, a dress.
you never saw her in any kind of slacks. Really, Granny Tim either. They always wore dresses. But Granny Tim would always have an apron, and there might be some tobacco from her snuff. You know, she was a wonderful cook and very down to earth and earthy. But Granny Miller was refined. And I remember going to her house and having to be in best behavior and spit shined and cleaned up, you know. And I remember her showing me pictures of loved ones and talking to me that way. There was never really any like play or she was just very reserved. So I'm about 10 and it's New Year's Eve and all the cousins are at my grandmother's house along with Granny Miller. And she was probably one of the first people to go to bed. And I got sent off to sleep with her because there were only so many beds and there were a lot of cousins. And I woke up in the morning and I couldn't wake her up. And I thought she was dead. I was scared to death. So I ran and got Granny, and it turned out that she had gone into a coma during the night. So that was a very traumatic memory because for months I thought, you know, she died in the bed with me, really. But no, she lingered in that coma for quite a while, like maybe almost a year. And so while I don't have a lot of stories or interactive memories with her, I have a very strong sense of who she was. And I'm going to guess that when you're a young mother with 2 daughters, and she had apparently been raised pretty strictly and pretty by the book, prim and proper, and your husband is killed, your world is probably shattered and you become very strong and get busy finding another husband. I mean, I don't know how close the second marriage was to his death, but by the time I came along in the 50s, she was clearly Olive Miller and Stuart Ivy was a faded memory.
How many children did she have with Stuart?
Just the 2 as far as, no, I'm lying to you. It just hit me. Uncle Bill, there were 3. So William Ivy was her son, and I believe he would have been in the middle of the 2 girls. And he became a citrus buyer. And I remember he always had a big radio in his truck with a big antenna. And unfortunately, what happened with him is his wife died, and they had daughters, I think 3. And he tried to raise the girls kind of by himself, and I think it was probably very difficult. And the girls began to leave home as they got old enough. And he actually died alone and wasn't discovered for a while because he was pretty isolated. He had developed schizophrenia. And I can remember as clear as day him coming. I put it on silent. I'm so sorry. Him coming to Granny's house and saying, "Sis, it's just all this interference. I can't think straight. It's all this interference." And of course, we all laughed about that. But now we understand that he was probably experiencing all kinds of unwanted guests in his mind, voices and visions and things that nobody else could see or hear. And so his death was sad. But he did, you know, reach maturity and have a good job and provide for his family before that happened. So there were 3 of them. And I'm sorry I forgot him earlier, but it was because he died so young.
I was about to ask, did he own any land, the citrus land, or was he just a buyer?
I believe he did, but I can't say for sure. But I remember they lived in a grove near my grandparents' grove, which theirs was a small grove, but it backed up to Disney property on Old Vineland Road out there.
The Bronson name is a very famous name in the state of Florida.
It is.
So are there other family members or friends that you'd like to mention that were Bronsons? I'm thinking in terms of Levy County. And Levy County seat is named Bronson.
Yes, it is.
And then the Bronsons were in charge of the agricultural division for the state of Florida.
Charlie Bronson is a distant cousin. And so are the Erlo Bronson family. And Erlo Bronson is the one who helped my dad get his start. Because my dad grew up in dire poverty. Both of my parents did. Hey, babe. No more shredding. It interferes with the sound.
Sorry.
It's okay. We're old and sometimes we just don't think.
It's no problem.
Sorry. Erlo owned lots of Osceola County property, and he was a state senator himself. And then his son, Bud, became senator as well. So Erlo was probably 60-ish when I was a little girl. And I remember going to his home, and he and Daddy would talk. And one of the things he did, there's a subdivision in Kissimmee, not far from the area where we're going, called Renee Terrace. I was much cuter then. And he sold my dad that property and let him pay for the lots as he sold the houses he built on them.
You said Renee Terrace?
I was much cuter then.
Oh, that's
I was also an only child
at that
at that time.
At that time.
Yes. So Erlo, this is unheard of in the construction industry. You know, you buy the land, you spend the money to develop it, you pay interest on every penny.
Right.
Not Erlo. He let him pay when the houses sold. So it probably gave him a magnanimous gift. It was a big subdivision for Kissimmee at the time. It was one of the first subdivisions, and it was all cow pasture all around it. But he sold him a section at a time, and then within that section, he would let him develop it, put in the roads and septic or sewer or whatever it was, and then the house might sit for sale for a year or two. And by the way, the houses were selling for $17,000.
Can you imagine?
Yeah. And so he let him pay as he went, which just really helped him get started. And I knew his grandchildren and his son and his wife. And still, I had dinner with his wife, with Bud's wife, maybe 2 years ago around Christmas time. So we're still in touch. And they sold the original property to Walt Disney, which became Disney World.
That's good history. Thank you for sharing that.
Of course.
I was not aware that they had done that.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that he told my dad as kind of a confidence at the time, you know. And so my dad took two of his builder friends and they all went out to Anaheim and they studied what happened there, which was pretty awful, and came back and said, hey, Kissimmee, we need to have zoning and we need to create barriers and protection for our current residents and their property values. And nobody listened. And so we have a mess, just like Anaheim does, only it's not as crowded for whatever reason. We probably had more real estate around it.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was life-changing. When I was a little girl, 192 was a 2-lane clay street, not even paved, red clay.
Really changed.
Well, I think We have taken up a lot of your time today, which I
So you
appreciate.
put up with a lot of my rambling too.
Well, do you have anything you'd like to add for the record? Anything at all before we close?
I wish I could think of something really meaningful and poignant. I guess my job is to instill hope, right? That's what I do all day, every day.
That's what we need more of.
So the hopeful thing is that I belong to a church in Kissimmee, in St. Cloud now, which is Methodist. And we have a racial reconciliation team. And I'm the team leader. Because at a covenant group meeting with our pastor, she was talking about how she was having trouble finding somebody to lead this team. And so my husband, who's an avowed atheist, pipes up and says, "We'll do it." I said, "We will?" He said, "Yeah, I'll help you. We can do this." And so all we do is little things, but we do it with great love.
And those are important things.
And we showed the movie Best of Enemies, and people came and participated and signed up to be on our team.
Yeah.
And they've been loyal and pray every day. The church proper sends out from the conference a daily prayer for reconciliation.
Wonderful.
And those people pray that prayer every day. And that gives me hope.
Absolutely. Have you all been to Montgomery, Alabama, about a Triple Reconciliation Group?
No, but I'm familiar with the people who wrote the book Cousins.
Yes.
And we gave a copy of the book Cousins to everyone on the team, and they've all read it and loved it. And I've talked to James Brown about whether he wants to meet them, because that's what they're about, is reconciliation. So those are glimmers of hope.
Yeah. Strong
That-
glimmers of hope, because we need that now.
So that my grandchildren don't grow up with the kind of hatred I've seen.
Well, another book is Just Mercy.
Oh, I don't know that one. I'll have to write it down.
That's by Stevens. Stevens is the person that's in charge of the whole center. He's helped to found the center.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. It's called Just Mercy.
Just Mercy.
The other one is not too old. I can't think of the title.
Well, it'll come up when we pull him up. Just Mercy.
Well, actually, there's one last thing we should probably get on film. And that is, speaking of truth and reconciliation, do you think the story that you're telling us about this episode in your family's history, do you think that will contribute to, well, the greater good, I guess?
I hope so. I hope so. I hope somebody somewhere will have heard me say to James Brown, "I'm so sorry someone in my family put your great-grandfather in that position to have to kill to save his own life. I'm so sorry." I hope somebody hears that and believes me.
They will, and they understand your sincerity in sharing that. That's the key.
That's my motivation.
That's the strength.
If enough
That's your
people will do that,
Yeah.
do this.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right. With that, we're going to press stop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deborah.
So if I could get you to say your name and for the
Okay.
camera.
My name is Garry Mogensen.
Okay, and Mr. Mogensen, what do you do for a living?
I'm presently retired. Originally, I was an educator for 42 years. I was started off as a 7th grade geography teacher, worked my way up to being an assistant principal, and I was in administration for 22 years, 3 years as an assistant principal, 19 years a principal. 10 of them were at St. Cloud Middle School, 9 and half were at Hickory Trail Elementary School, and I ended my career in high school. So I've been all 3 levels as a teacher at Gateway High School, and as the teacher that I taught civics in Kissimmee, in St. Cloud. but it's gateways in Kissimmee. But civics and economics and history and American history, that is, and government teacher. Those are my subjects at Gateway High School. The first school I taught at was Beaumont Middle School. The second school I taught at was Den John Middle School. I was an assistant principal at St. Cloud Middle School, principal at St. Cloud Middle School, principal at Hickory Tree Elementary School, and then I was a teacher at Gateway High School for primarily juniors and seniors, where I got to teach Isaiah Wharton, who went on to be an NFL player. And in fact, Isaiah was one of my favorite students. I kept having him come back to visit me, along with the football coaches, to make sure he was doing okay. But he had a notable career at Rutgers and went on to the NFL, and I think he might still be playing.
So who wants to do the talking? Either one.
Renee. She's a
So I'm Renee Bronson, here today with my husband, Garry Mogensen.
At today's date.
And today's date is February 12th, 2023.
Thank you.
Okay. I think we've got to. Thank you so much.
Bless your heart.
It's going to look really good. Don't worry.
Let's go.